Welcome everyone. Very happy to be here today. Thank you for joining this side meeting. As I said before as well, we believe we found a very good format to actually engage with everyone and build this community in which we're all trying to find better ways of working, especially now in distributed engineering teams. Many of us had to rethink how we do our work. So today we'll be discussing requirements verification and test management for small satellites. Before we dive deep, we'll start with a small interactive session in which we'll be getting to know each other around the table for everyone to have an idea of who's in the room, what kind of expertise is here, and what kind of questions will be answered throughout the session. Then I'll give a very short intro to the session, and then we'll dive into the whole roundtable discussion. I'll brief everyone on the format. So for all of you who are just joining now, please head over to ahaslides.com/smallsat20, and then you'll be able to engage with everyone else as well. So maybe before we get into the deep waters, let's just make sure that we learn something about each other and everyone who's at this virtual roundtable. So the first question to everyone who's here is, which country are you joining from today? I'm sure we're all quite distributed. I see Germany, India, United States, Bulgaria, USA, Italy, Portugal, Spain. Okay, the number of countries are growing. A lot of USA, United States. Yeah, so what's interesting now is that typically we're all in one single place, but I'd like to believe that now that we're moving virtual, although it's unfortunate we can't see each other in person, that this kind of format also has its advantages, that we can reach different people and speak with different people than we would typically speak with. Okay, great. So thank you very much for answering. I see 32 people have already answered. For those of the participants who are just joining now, please join us at ahaslides.com/smallsat20, and then you can join us in the interactive session both now and later throughout the roundtable discussions. Great. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. So next up, what is your current role? We received a very diverse set of applications. We were actually overwhelmed with the amount of interest for this session today. So we're excited to learn who's here today now with us, and also to show to the rest of the audience who they'll be engaging with today. Okay, so quite some students, directors, C-level suite, CTO, CEOs, likely systems engineers, project managers, project engineers. Okay, very nice. Other. All right, fantastic. So quite a diverse set of folks. One professor. Okay, very nice. Thank you for sharing, everyone. I'm sure that we'll all have a different angle and an approach to the topics of the day. So very interesting to see that we have such a diverse community here today. Maybe some brief fun questions before we get into the deeper waters. Let's see, what do you think? In which decade will humans land on Mars? Okay, 2030s. Everyone seems to be 2030s, 2040s. I think we're a pretty optimistic crowd today. That's nice. 2020s even, fantastic. All right. 2040s keep growing. All right, so clearly 2030s. I'd like to believe that with the session today, we'll get closer to that goal. Thank you very much for answering and sharing your positivity and your optimism with us today. Let's move on to the next question. Where do you think we should go first, Mars or back to the moon? Okay, the lunar team is growing in numbers very rapidly. Not that many today. Fancying playing golf on Mars, I see. All right, fantastic. All right, so today I imagine that the lessons we'll be learning, aside from SmallSats, I imagine that we can also implement to go back to the moon as well. So thank you for sharing, everyone. For those of you who are just joining us, please join us at ahaslides.com/smallsat20, and then you can engage with the rest of us in the interactive session, as well as during the whole roundtable discussions. So now moving on to a bit more serious questions. So the topic of today is clear, and what words come to mind when you think of these topics? Requirements, verification, test management. What would be the first words that pop into your mind? If you could just share that with us, it could be anything you feel or you've experienced, or anything that comes to mind. Hard, it's definitely hard. Traceability is definitely important. Absolutely, those are two good points. Simulation tools, systems engineering. Okay, seeing more and more words popping up. Validation, doors, lab, security, bureaucracy, experience, documentation, scripting, vibration, costs, get organized. I really hope that we can get organized. I see a central topic popping up here, which is documentation, and we'll definitely be touching upon that today. Just as many others, such as traceability, reliability, validation. I'll just wait a few more seconds for everyone to be able to submit their answers. Not done well enough. Well, that's indeed something that we can always improve, but we're all trying our best, and I hope that by the end of today, we'll be able to try our best even more. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. Documentation is definitely a central topic, so we'll make sure to return to that later. And then if you could maybe share with us if there were a few key lessons that you'd like to be able to take home with you today, what would those be? I think this is something that is not just for us to better understand, but also for everyone in the audience to understand who's here. Like we saw that there's different types of people in the audience. Let's see what you'd like to also take away from this. Automation, best practices, frameworks to work within, how to streamline work, how to be more lean, documentation practices, lots of best practices, absolutely. Yeah, so the best practices for today that will come both from the audience as well as from what we've seen in the past, working with different clients, as well as from experience. So definitely best practices will be one of the key topics here today. Fantastic. I see already more than 40 people have answered. So for those of the participants who are joining us a little bit later, if you could please head over to ahaslides.com/smallsat20, either via your phone or via the web browser, and then you can join us in all these interactive sessions, as well as during the roundtable discussions later. Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. And then one last question before we dive deep. How do you plan your testing? Do you typically plan for testing, everything before design? Do you do everything maybe in agile sprints? Design and top-down planning? No rigid planning at all? Okay. Okay, so the majority of the people here are designing and then doing a top-down approach of planning the testing. Fantastic, thank you so much for sharing, everyone. This is definitely interesting to understand, and I'm sure it will be coming up across the whole roundtable discussions, different approaches to actually plan testing. Okay, great. So then now we're ready to get started. Very nice to get to know everyone a little bit better. I think it's very clear what we've gathered for today. We have another 50 minutes left. So I'll just give a very, very brief introduction who we are and why Valispace is actually organizing this session. And I'll start off with a very brief video.
What would the final velocity of the rocket be if we change the fuel mix ratio to 4.5?
right to it. We need to find out what the final velocity would be if we change the fuel mix ratio to 4.5.
This is a nightmare. This calculation hasn't been updated in years.
Who does even calculates in pounds per cubic foot? This value cannot be right.
This is not going to
The
work.
oxidizer density in the draft 3 analysis, the current one.
Alexa, start Valispace.
Welcome to Valispace.
What would the final velocity of the rocket be if we change the fuel mix ratio to 4.5?
The final velocity would be 14.3 kilometers per second.
Okay, so this is who we are. We're Valispace, and Valispace is a browser-based tool which allows engineers to be more efficient. In short, what we're all about is we're trying to increase the traceability and have full traceability along the engineering lifecycle. So all the way from early on requirements engineering, early concurrent designs, connecting to simulation tools, up to testing and documentation. So essentially what we've seen from our complete customer base, whether it's startups in the new space industry or larger corporations or agencies, a lot of these types of questions, they keep coming back. So we've been learning a lot and growing a lot alongside our customers, particularly now that many of them are moving towards the testing phase, which is also why we've recently released our new testing module. So this is also what really brings us here today. And together with our CEO, who we've invited here today, Marco Witzman, we'll be trying to shed some light together with the community, with everyone who's joined us here today. I see we're already 75 participants here. Basically, having this roundtable discussion in this specific format has really allowed us to be able to engage even more than we typically do. So as you know, a roundtable discussion is oftentimes just 5 to 10 people, but now we've actually found a format in which we can invite even more people to the table and really leverage that experience. I'll show in a little bit how that format will exactly work. And our CEO will then also share from his experience working on large satellites, particularly for MTG at OHB in Bremen, what those specific lessons were that he learned over the years, as well as working with our customers in the last few years as part of Valispace as well.
Hello, everyone. Looking forward to this.
So the specific format of how we'll be doing things today is we will be basically posing a few of the, let's say, more general topics and questions that we have seen are really important. And then the audience will have 1 to 2 minutes to answer something to that. And what we'll basically do, you will have, let's say, 1 minute of quiet time, and everyone can upvote each other's answers. So at that point in time, we'll see what the different answers are and the different, let's say, questions are posed, the different problems that people are seeing. And the most upvoted ones will basically select. We will ask for the people whose most upvoted topics to basically raise their hand inside Zoom. So if you can find that menu later today where you can basically just raise your hand, then we'll be able to unmute you and you can expand a bit further on the topic. And we'll make sure to basically engage amongst ourselves on that specific topic. And do not worry, anything that is not covered throughout this session, we will make sure to follow up in a complete report. So this whole session is being recorded. We will document everything, and we'll basically make sure we break everything down in a very nice report for you to have as well. So I think we're ready to get started. And we'll get started with the very first point, which is what are the biggest pains when it comes to managing verifications and tests? So we have a whole lot of people in the audience today, and I'm sure that everyone has different pains that they've witnessed in the past. So you're able to basically take now 1 minute and just think of those biggest pains and answer them here. And while you see that the different points are popping up, you can also upvote each other's answers. So I'll just wait 1 minute for everyone to be able to answer here. I see a lot of hearts popping up. Okay, so I see a first one, requirements written are not testable or verifiable. That definitely sounds like a pain. And biggest requirements, new team members, absolutely. So please also make sure to upvote each other's answers so we can see what the biggest ones are being. All right, fantastic. I think we have already 10 specific pains. So at this point in time, I'd like to pin the very first one that we have upvoted here. Someone wrote here, requirements written are not testable and verifiable. Maybe if you could just briefly raise your hand, my colleague Maria can then actually unmute you and you can maybe expand a little bit further on that pain. What the specific things are that you're witnessing when you actually move forward to managing verifications and testing. So do I see the raised hand here? Okay, I don't see a raised hand here immediately, but it is for sure a pain that many of us can relate to. Marco, what do you think? How should people manage that requirements are written in a way that they are testable and they are verifiable?
I think indeed, from what we see from our customers, that's definitely a huge problem, right? In general, requirements quality is probably something that people worry a lot about. I think we've seen two approaches to this. One approach to this is basically seeing people trying to have standards of how to write requirements. So they have a huge list of things that need to be done for the requirement to actually be a valid or good requirement. They make sure in reviews that these points actually come through. And testability or verifiability is actually then one of these points, right? And you might see other things that they should be always just addressing one topic and not multiple at the time and so on. So I think one of them is this kind of approach. There's even tools out there I've seen that can automatically check requirements quality and try to give like indexes like about that. I'm personally a bit skeptical about those because usually it's very hard. I mean, I can still write a requirement which syntactically sounds good, but if I say, I don't know, the spacecraft shall not explode in space, that's still an untestable requirement, right? So I think the second approach to it is a bit different, right? The second approach to this, instead of trying to put the focus on the requirement quality and trying from the very beginning to like get all the requirements perfectly written, is to, in a very early stage, while you're still designing, to already start thinking about the test cases. So we see some of the customers like starting to write test cases already, even if it's just the headlines, right? It might not even be the detailed test, but the fact that you're writing the test cases and that you're giving them a title and trying to bundle them and then linking those requirements to these test cases, that allows you very quickly to find out if you have no idea how you would do that, right? Like, is that an explosion test, or in which test would you test that? And I think the moment that you take this more iterative approach, instead of saying, okay, requirements have to be perfect, then I can hand them over, then someone else can write the testing, saying this is actually a continuous process in which the test cases are named in the beginning, even if empty, then linked, then you find the orphaned children and find out, okay, which ones are the requirements which we agreed to test, but we have no idea which test case it could be. And then you go back and rewrite those requirements, make them testable. So that contradicts a bit the thing that we saw before, right? Like when we looked at the answers before, there was a lot of question. People were saying we first design and then we design the top-down testing structure. But this requires slightly different thinking, right? This requires bringing some part, at least, of the testing approach already to the design stage to make sure that these requirements are fine.
And I think one thing that actually ties into here is also the ambiguous requirements. How do you really move away from that? Is there like a framework that people can follow? I saw in the beginning, people are asking for a framework, best practices, guidelines on that topic. How do you move away from writing ambiguous requirements, basically?
Again, I think the same thing applies here, the two approaches, right? So one is having guidelines, making sure that you review the requirements. And if you just have a second person reviewing it and that person doesn't understand it, it's already a good indicator that it's probably ambiguous. On the other hand, the other way to do it is to really start with a very small set of requirements which are on the top level, and then have a good traceability towards broken down requirements, right? So if you really do requirements breakdown well, and then you have some kind of way to show all of these requirements together. So you show the top level requirement that came, maybe in an ideal case, your mission requirements should just be 10 or something like this, not more. And then you see on the lower levels how it has been broken down. If you have a way to visualize like the top requirement and all the other requirements that are related to it, that gives you actually a more wholesome understanding of the requirement, right? It might not be what the person first intended. But I'm not saying that this helps you not to write the ambiguous requirement in the first place, but it shows you how every subsystem and unit and so on has interpreted this requirement. And if you get that kind of a view, and then you don't review requirements per specification, but you review requirements basically per tree, you get the full vision. You get the full vision of how these things are related. And that's where you can find out, oh, this subsystem thought it meant that, the software thought it meant that, and so on. You hopefully find at least some of these ambiguities this way. It's not foolproof, but I still believe it's from what we've seen, it's a better approach than having a review for the system requirement, then having a review for the software requirement, then having a review for the other requirements in an empty space, right, outside of seeing where they come from and how they are related.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, Marco. I think if anyone wants to jump in here on any of these topics that we're talking about, so if you click on the bottom of your screen, you'll see the participants part, and then you will see on the left that you have all these menus, as I showed earlier, where you can actually raise your hand. So if you can do that, then we can actually unmute you and you can join us in this conversation. If that's something that you cannot find, you're welcome to drop a text to either one of us, to Marco, Maria, or me, and we can also just unmute you and you can engage in the conversation as well. All right, so maybe just one more point. I see here an upvoted one. I'm not sure, Marco, if this is from you or another Marco. I see how to make sure all requirements are fulfilled, knowing if even that is enough for your spacecraft to not explode.
Well, it is indeed for me. It's something I'd really like to know. Maybe there's someone here in the audience who can shed a bit of light on it. I think there's two parts of it, right? One is verification and one is validation. So in verification, you actually make sure that each requirement is fulfilled, which still doesn't mean that you get what you wanted in the first place, right? And I think although this distinction in academia is very clear, and there has been a very clear idea, okay, this means that, I would really be curious to hear if anyone has some experience to share where they say, okay, this is our validation approach. That is how we make sure that even when all the boxes are checked, we feel fine, we feel confident to launch, right? So if anyone has something here, use the reaction bar at the bottom to like wave or something. Any of those things, we'd be happy to like unmute you and listen to if you have anything to share. Maybe it's a too hard question. Oh, there's someone.
Chris Badgett is raising hand. Fantastic. So I think I can unmute you directly from here. Chris, you should be live now.
Do you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
So Marco, it's it's a great old question, right? How do you indicate validation is the real thing that you want out of it? And it kind of marries up to whether, my feeling is, does it marry up to whether you're doing more agile, iterative process, because that feedback from a user or the validation can come directly at the end of that sprint, right? Yeah, sure. I made what I thought, or I made it, it works. Is it the right thing? Well, you can have someone give you that feedback immediately, right? Unfortunately, in more of a static, one-off, waterfall development, build the rocket, launch the rocket, you've got one shot. So it's kind of I'm kind of cheating a little bit, because there's no real, you don't have that validation unless you really do it by simulation for those one-off events.
So do you usually involve like customers and things like this in these sprints? And the second question I have for you then is, how long are these, right? I know that in software cadences are 2 weeks, but probably for building SmallSats, that's like a different kind of loops that you should go. What's your experience here? Yeah, so my view of the world is really from the ground infrastructure side. So again, I get to cheat a little bit from that standpoint. But even on the ground, as you're building up large programs, yeah, you can still always do those incremental, bring someone in, sit them down, say, is this what you're expecting to see at the end state, right? So it's always an incremental, bring them in, pick your increment, pick your frequency. It's just trying to get the feedback from the validation. It just becomes a really hard part when you only have one event that you can really do it in. Yeah. Thanks so much, Chris. I think that's very valuable. So I think my takeaway from this is at least bringing in your customer, whoever that might be, could be internal, external, in like regular ways, so that they can actually give feedback, that you don't go into like deep dive mode, come up at the end and then find out you did the wrong thing. That's great. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing. Okay, fantastic. So for all the other points that were raised, we'll make sure to go through them and assemble basically a very nice report for everyone with additional feedback and answers in here, and distribute it across all the participants of today. So moving on to the next question. I think, okay. So moving on to the next question. I'm just going to mark all of those as answered. Where do you start when you're doing verification testing for the first time? So for now, I'm just quickly marking all these as answered, so you can actually answer in peace. So if you're starting for the very first time, like how do you get started? I think these are some very interesting questions. This is also something that we received from the majority of quite a few people when they signed up. It's like, okay, I have had this job for a few years, and now I'm actually moving forward, and I have to learn this from scratch. So if you can take a few seconds to maybe share your experience, and then we can also raise any hands if anyone wants to also directly engage on this and join the discussion. That would be great. Okay, so I see some upvoted ones here. The first point is start with requirements and develop the test plans. So maybe the person who wrote that, if you could maybe just raise your hand and expand a bit further on that, that would be great. If any one of these, basically, I'm just going to pin them all. Get the experts, look at similar projects, component level, fundamentals, bottom up. If anyone wants to engage here, please raise your hand and we'll unmute you. I'm sure that many of you have very interesting insights to share with the community here. So meanwhile, Marco, if you'd like, I see Vishal LB raised hand. Maria, if you can quickly help me out here and unmute Vishal.
Hi, Stefan.
Hi, Vishal.
Yes, good to see you here, Stefan. We studied together at Delft.
Very nice to see you here.
Yeah. So if I may just expand on that, yes, ideally, I think it's a two-part answer. Ideally, for a verification thing, I would, go for a top-down approach where I, trace it from the initial requirements that were created in terms of setting up the mission itself. But when I think about it from, starting on the testing side, I'm just going to see what I have in my hand with respect to the fundamental component that makes up the subsystem itself, or the, the very fundamental unit of the system. So that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to see if it works the way it works for me. If I'm going to say this is a resistor that should measure 10, that should be 10 kilo ohms, I'm just going to start from there. And then build up on expanding to see what the functionality of that sub-module should be, and then expand it to the higher levels of the abstracted module. And I think that's the ideal way we usually look at. This goes ahead and matches with, when you start the verification itself, and you somehow meet in the middle between the verification and testing. But ideally, I would say that is what I mean by starting from bottom up, fundamentals, going towards making sure the components work the way you need it to be. And then I think validation will come as the next step to make sure, all the traceability through and through. So that's kind of what I was trying to say there. Yeah. Thanks, Stefan.
Okay, thank you so much for expanding on that, Vishal. Anyone wanting to pick up on that? So, Vishal, I'm going to lower your hand now. Meanwhile, I'm curious to hear from someone who wrote, get the experts, look at similar projects. In terms of reusing these types of lessons learned, I'd be curious to hear, how would you go about that when you have to onboard someone who's doing this for the first time? Marco, if you'd like to pick up on this.
Yeah, I think I'll jump in. I think it actually connects quite well with what I was about to say. So I think it's a two-parted site, right? One of it is the actual content, right? And I think what we just heard from Vishal is probably exactly right. It's going like bottom up, like you looked at the unit works, looked at the subsystem works, looked at the full system works, looked that you actually verify what you needed to do for the mission. Like if you start building up your plan like this, I mean, it sounds super straightforward. It actually is not, right? The question is like, where do you verify these things? Sometimes you can do a lot of testing in the beginning and then you don't have time for system tests. Otherwise, you do system tests, you have no idea why something failed and you have to go all the way back. So it's not as straightforward. But maybe on a more meta level, and that is also related to the, like, get the experts, look at similar projects, is I would say, make sure that you have a clear approach, right? So when you work on big projects, like with agencies or something like this, they will force you to write a verification plan. They will force you to write in one of those. And a lot of times in these big projects, somebody writes the plan and it's thrown away into the drawer and nobody doing the actual work really knows what's in there. So there's like a parallelism of what you wrote and what you're doing. And then in the last version, you take it out again and you update everything that you actually did so that you can hand in something that is coherent. So that's obviously not the idea, right? If you're really trying to do it, then don't write the plan for someone, write it for yourself, right? Like have an idea of how you want to go about it. Like where do I want to store my requirements, right? How do I link my requirements to my test cases? What is actually a test case? Like on what kind of level of detail do I want to describe the test case? Then is there like a test procedure? Is that a similar thing or different thing than my test case, right? If I run something on a one software version, do I force myself to run it again on the other software version or not? Like, I mean, you're making trade-offs in each of them, but just make them actively. Like, think what you want to do in general. It doesn't mean, especially in the SmallSat business, that you cannot deviate from it if you later find out that it should be different. It just means start thinking about the approach that you want to follow. And here I think comes in what this anonymous just wrote here about getting the experts, right? It's like, if you can get your hands on a test plan, on I don't know, maybe a test procedure, an example, or something that somebody has made, they have probably gone through a lot of these iterations. They have seen a lot of ways of how you can write them badly and well. So you will make less mistakes if you just start from that as a starting point. But you might have to adjust it, right? Because I mean, don't take the test plan from a €2 billion project and try to apply it to your CubeSat, right? You're gonna die in the process and your thing is never gonna launch. And the other way around is also so true, right? I think the most important thing is that you set up also like the plan and also a system which helps you, right? Like, I mean, whatever tool you use, if it's spreadsheets, if it's a tool, whatever it is, just know, okay, this is the place where I'm gonna have my requirements. What do I do if I update one, right? Like, who is in charge to make sure that this still fits to the tests and to know which ones have run and which ones not? So I think that kind of process thinking is probably something that you should do somewhere at the beginning. And then sometimes the tools help you, right? Like the tools can help you, give you some of this guidance already. If Hit by Design helps you link things, or if Hit by Design helps you comment on things, that takes something away from it, but it doesn't take away the thinking for you, like what the process behind should be. So I would say both. Think on the content, but also think on the overall process and tool side. And I think Gina raised her hand.
Exactly.
Too.
I see Gina's raising her hand. Gina, I'm going to unmute you and you can pick up on this.
Hi, my name is Gina Amanatullah. I'm from Explore Inc., which is based in Seattle, doing commercial space exploration, SmallSats. And I came from StratoLaunch, which was down also in Seattle with lots of complex interfaces, and we were working through a whole requirements and verification strategy before flight testing started. But I guess aside from all that, what I just wanted to add to the conversation is cost. And there might be a budget that you have to bear in mind and stay within for your verification plan. So that might limit some of the testing you do, and you might have to pick and choose what type of testing, and if you use testing versus another verification method, analysis or simulation can often be, a cheaper way to verify requirements versus doing all tests. And so I think that kind of sort of plays into the type of mission you're doing, the class of the mission. Is it a Class D mission, which is open to more risk versus a Class A mission? And then as far as getting started for the first time and resources, there are lots of resources out there for folks to, I think, tap into, at least to get you started. Like the NASA Systems Engineering Handbook is a good one. There's an equivalent handbook, I think, at Aerospace Corporation. And then there's I think it's called Applied Systems Engineering, is a SMAD type of textbook that you can, that goes into a lot of the verification. So if you're just starting out and want to kind of wrap your head around sort of the basics of it, there are lots of resources out there. Thank you.
That's a great point, Gina. And I think thanks a lot for this. And everyone, like if you have any of these resources which are public and linked, if you send them to us after this session, we will make sure to compile them all together. Like we know some of them obviously, but then you might know more. So we will, if you send them to us by the end of today, then we'll also make sure that they go into the report. That would be great. And I completely agree with you, Gina. Like we've seen also people on two sides of the spectrum, right? Between a requirements-driven approach and a test-driven approach. Like I know that at least at the early days at Planet Labs, for example, what they did is they built a test stand, and then that test stand, they would put their new spacecraft in it, and they would basically do nightly testing, right? So they would see, does it still pass all the tests? So instead of like having huge traceability and going through these parts and making sure that everything works, it might even be cheaper to test every time if you're building a lot of them. Obviously, it has something to do with scale and it has to do with other things, but in their case, it made sense to build a test stand which basically ran all the system tests every night, and then you would not have a problem about regression.
We're going to build
things.
upon that in a bit as well.
Yeah, and it might be cheaper, right? So, but that might be the case for them in their case, right? I'm just saying that's why it's important to think about the process, and as you said, Gina, to decide on this, what works with your budget and which one is the risk that you're taking, but then also actively taking, right? Because only if you know and constantly and decide, okay, that's a risk we're going to take, then you can manage that risk because you can find mitigations. Great points from you. Thanks so much.
Thank you both so much for sharing. Moving on to the next question. We won't unfortunately have time to answer all of them for now. So I'm just going to mark them as answered for the time being, and we'll get back to them in the report later. Moving on to the next question. So what would be most important for you for your requirements breakdown? If you can just take 30 seconds to think of some of these key points and then start raising your hands if you want to start engaging on some of these topics as well. I know that we've mentioned already quite a few points throughout the first two questions. Linking of requirements, understanding functionality, understanding rationale, okay, so I'm just going to ask the people who have been answering these questions here, if you can just raise your hand and we can just straight away start with the discussion. Okay, I don't see anyone raising hands for the time being. I think understanding the rationale of the parent requirement is definitely a key point here. Understanding the functionality and usage, same. Lists of the actionable items to go through and assign dates and personnel to. This is project management related. I think, okay, Amber, I see that you want to share something with us.
Hi, I'm Amber. So mine's the list of actionable items. So this one's a really big one because so I work heavily on the radiation side of things. And so with our team, there's a large number of requirements that get flowed not only to how we test, but also how we interact with other groups within the company. So it's really important to understand which items need to stay within our group and which items we need to start flowing information to other groups for, or how we need to customize this information for various programs. Especially from a radiation perspective, you're going to get requirements that could have very large factors of difference between them. So just doing a standard value in a database is not always the best approach. And then this also flows out into when you're doing this, creating a reasonable approach for how long it would take you to get that information, and then which personnel that you're going to use for it. That can be really important because certain items, when especially you go into testing like single event effects, the complications of testing more complicated parts like processors and FPGAs may require that you not only reach into your personnel, but to effectively do it, you also grab people from the company who are going to use those parts. So you're having mature conversations about what's going to be going on within the designs and what primitives are of particular concerns.
Thank you so much for sharing, Amber. Yeah, absolutely. I think essentially it is about ensuring that you share the right information to the right people at the right point in time, and thinking ahead when it comes to that.
I think what I also liked about what you just said is there might be much more behind it, right? You were saying these mature conversations about like how things are evolving and so on. I think that's also a very important factor. Like it's from our experience, what we've seen is when people start only communicating over documents, that's when things fall down, right? Because you're losing that understanding. And I think that also goes here with the first point that is here raised, understanding the rationale of the parent requirements. It's like, just because it's written, somebody might write, I don't know, maximum radiation this much. And it could be for that person a very hard requirement. It could be like impossible. If you go only a bit over that, your processor dies down. But it could also be something that somebody just copy pasted from an old standard and said like, that's probably fine, and had not really an idea, or could be a margin of 20% on top of it. And if you don't dig down, and if you don't have that conversation, then you might be over engineering or over testing, right? Like you might not reach that level and then have huge discussions about the problems while not even understanding what the intention of the requirement was in the first place, right? So I do fully support that part, that the written part is only a very small part. And I can just share an anecdote from a bigger project that I've been working on. I remember it was a very sensitive timing issue that we had there. It was like a clock on the satellite, and it had a very specific time requirement that was needed for this imagery. And we were off, right? Like the equipments that we could buy that were available on the market just didn't fit. And it was a topic that dragged on for months, but it was impossible in that program, which dragged on for 10 years, to understand who had actually written that original requirement. What was the intention of that one? And is it actually a real thing or not? And also hard to know who had taken this value into account in their simulations, and what would happen if we had to change or adapt. So it took us months. And the main reason for this is because we didn't have that. We didn't have that accountability of that requirement belongs to that person. We didn't have the linkage between that requirement was fed into this use case and was fed into that other simulation and was fed into these other things. And if we had that, then we would probably have not discussed, I don't know, probably 3/4 of a year about that, but we would rather have been able to have that sit down and that discussion. So I highly recommend using things like rationales and requirements, like giving some extra context, giving some sources, like where does this come from? Does it come from a standard? Does it come from an engineering guess? Also be honest in this, right? Especially if you're looking at this internally, you don't have to share this always with your customer, but at least internally inside your team, like put in engineering guess. And then when you come back and you find that there's a problem with this, you know it's a different kind of discussion that you're going to have than if you say this is the data sheet and we lose the guarantee the moment we, I don't know, use this thing one more time than we should. So make sure that the requirements are more than just the text. Make sure that it has context. Make sure that it has a responsible person who still knows why it is there, and try to link it if you can in any way to all the places this has been used. If you have technical methods of tracing where this value of the requirement has been used in analysis, do that. It will save you a lot of hours and nerves once you get further down the line.
Thank you so much for sharing, both Amber and Marco. Unfortunately, we only have about 10-15 minutes left, and I'd like to really go with 2 more questions. So we'll definitely make sure to read through all the answers that everyone has given and address those in our follow-up report. So next one up is then, what's most important for verification methods and their assignments? You can straight away also raise your hand if you'd like to maybe answer verbally instead of writing it out, capturing assumptions. Very similar to the rationale behind requirements of the previous one. sure the chosen verification method is adequate. Nathan, would you like to maybe expand a bit further on your question? I don't see you immediately. Okay, Nathan just shared with me that he doesn't currently have a microphone, but thank you so much for sharing. If anyone else wants to pick up on that, I think getting the buy-in from the customer to each method is sufficient, definitely a very important one. We see some more really heavily upvoted ones. Be sure that chosen verification method is adequate. Anonymous, if you would like to raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can expand a bit on that. Documentation. Yeah, I think all of these answers are probably worth discussing at least a few minutes on, if not much longer. So we'll make sure to capture those in our reports more extensively as well.
And maybe just a short comment from my side. I really agree with what is said here, right? It's all about not only reviewing the requirements, also about reviewing the verifications.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about putting a T next to every requirement and just say, yeah, we're going to test this. But as we said before, like if you think about testing, think how you can, is it possible to test that so that you can really close out this requirement? Also thinking about the question when you break down requirements, if I have verified each of the children, does that verify my parent automatically? Do I need a dedicated test for this? That's something that oftentimes gets overlooked. So at least think about this before so that you know once you come to the closeout that you don't find, oh shit, we should have actually put more system tests in place that we didn't think of before.
Mark, when you wrote here, plan for the possibility of multiple verification methods on multiple models. Can you maybe share with the audience what you mean with that?
I think what a lot of times what we've seen is that people start very simple, right? They say, okay, there's one requirement and I'm going to have one verification. So they make the Excel spreadsheet and that's it. Sounds nice. And then they come up with, oh, damn, probably we should, part of this, we need to actually analyze. Maybe it comes to propulsion, right? So some of it you can only show, you can measure, and some of it you can only then do calculations with if that fulfills the full requirement. So you'll find out, oh, now we actually need 2 different verification methods for the same thing. And then you will find out, oh, should we actually do that on the flight model or should we do that on the engineering model or on the AVM or on the whatever you're doing, right? And a lot of times people start with a very simple idea and then their spreadsheet or whatever it is like grows and gets more complex and then you find out, oh, and I should link it to the other thing and so on. So just from the very beginning, start to think about it, that this is a possibility that you have to take into account these things and that you might have to take a decision that's more complex. You can in the beginning, usually it's an iterative process, right? In the beginning, just say, okay, it's going to be tested. Then you say, okay, it's going to be tested where, right? On which equipment? And then you're going to say, oh, it's going to be tested and analyzed and so on. And what's the name of these analysis? Who does that? So only if you know what the bar is, and coming also back to what we had before, right? Looking at budget, you cannot do infinite things. So you have to plan for what are you going to do to have a realistic account. And then you see, okay, there is 200 tests we're planning to do, each of them supposedly taking a month. Is that realistic with the planning that we have overall, right? And if not, better be honest with yourself and then reduce and say, okay, we're just going to have to trust on this one or not.
I see quite a few more points coming up here. So we're almost at the end of our session. We only have about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to actually move on to the last question to the audience. So as I said before, we'll definitely make sure to address a lot of these points in our final report. So what will be most important for you for test management as a final question to close it off? Then we'll have closed that loop entirely. So documentation again, I think this is the point in time in which we'll definitely be discussing that clear, useful test plan, test procedures. Okay, so I see a few topics here which are very clear: is the documentation, the capturing of test procedures, making test procedures in a way that they can actually change over time when necessary, refine them. So anyone who wants to share something here live with the rest of the audience? Okay, Marco, you can maybe just take a minute to explain a bit further what you mean with refining the test procedures over time.
Sure. So, I mean, it comes a bit down also to the very first point, right? I think it's the most important point probably that it was there, which is documentation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the idea is you should write down what you plan to do and then also what you actually did. And the reality is you're never gonna write the procedure and then just run it and it's gonna be fine. It's like, I've not seen it happen ever. And I don't have any customers who have managed to do that ever, I think. So what is gonna be happening is that you're gonna have a rough idea, right? It's gonna be switch on the equipment, measure this, switch off the equipment. And then you're gonna get better at understanding, right? Switching on the equipment actually means putting the pressure onto this amount and then setting up the parameter to this and then switching on the other module. And if this blinks red, then do this and so on, right? So, and then you're gonna actually run it for the first time and then you're gonna be redlining and you're gonna be saying, okay, this didn't work, and this didn't work. And you're gonna change the procedure as it goes. But you still wanna record what you did, right? You wanna record, okay, which equipment did I have actually? What was in there? Which software was running and so on? Not only for purposes to prove anything later, but especially when something goes wrong later, you will want to look back and want to say, okay, this worked here. What did we do differently, right? And documentation always sounds horrible. It sounds like a lot of work. But again, I think if you have set up the right processes and tooling, it doesn't have to be, right? I don't think you have to print out procedures and make signatures next to it and then have big folders of redlined scripts anywhere. And then somebody has to pass them on. I think we are in a digital age which allows you to do many of these things better. Just make sure that it stores the history of what you did, right? Like if you updated the procedure, make sure that you know when it was updated, by whom, which test was still run on the old version, which one was in the new version, right? And I think that's the most important part about documentation. It's not only about writing it down once and putting it into a folder. It's about a traceable writing down.
Great. So I see that we have actually run out of time for today. So I'd like to move on with actually, first of all, really thanking everyone for all the inputs. I think this was an extremely interesting point in time in which we were actually surprised to see how many reactions we've gotten and how many people want to participate. So I'd like to maybe just ask you for one more minute to answer some very basic questions about the format and the topic. Because as you've seen, we barely scratched the surface with some of these conversations, and it will be interesting to know how we can maybe change the format in the future or the topic, or maybe redo it and make it a bit longer. So thank you so much for sharing. Thanks so much for sharing all your insights. As I said before, we'll be making sure to capture all these thoughts and insights that you've been sharing with us into a very nice report for you to also be able to take away, as well as the recording of today. So thank you very much for voting. This definitely gives us a good insight. I'm happy to hear and to see that you liked both the format and the topic, and we can also expand with new topics next time. And then maybe I have one more question, which is, what would you like to focus on more in depth next time? we have the options of requirements management, verification management, test management. So for those of you who maybe liked one part in particular a bit more in depth, we'd be curious to know what we can focus on in the future as well.
Stefan, I think you have to click on show results.
Yeah. Okay, so requirements management so far seems like the one topic that should probably expand a bit further on. It was also clear that we could have spent quite some time on that. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing. And then one final question. I'd be curious to know, like, in case we do these next sessions, like, what format would you like to see then? Is it more like a beginner's guide where we share, if you get started with this, this is how you get started. These are some best practices. Would you maybe like to see talks, or maybe rather like a round table discussion between professionals, like different people with different types of experiences? Okay, so we seem divided. We'll definitely have some food for thought here. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. This has been an absolutely amazing session. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you so much for signing up. We'll make sure to share all the results with you, as well as the recording and the report. And then we look forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, thank you. I also would like to say thank you very much for joining. We hope this was useful. I think it seemed like it, thanks everyone for engaging on the tool and also in person by sharing a bit. We know that 1 hour is super short, and we would have loved to do a bit more, but we wanted to keep a balance. So if you have any points that you would like, any ideas for the next session, if you have any resources that you want to share with the rest here, like we talked before about like places to get started, any of this, then just like write it to either the email address you got the email from or to stefan@valispace.com here, down here. And we'll make sure to put this into the report. We'll make sure to take that into account for the next session. Also, if you have any other feedback, good or bad, we're always happy to hear. And well, with this, we wish you a very nice rest of SmallSat. Thanks for joining the site meeting, and see you hopefully next time.